Indeed, there it is. I'd also like to start tonight by acknowledging that for those of us who are joining from around Australia, we're living and working on the unceded lands of some of the longest living cultures of this world. I'm joined tonight from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in the Kulin Nations here in Naarm or Melbourne. And I pay my sincere respects to the elders, both past and present of this country. And we invite you all to share in the chat here, the chat function tonight, where you're joining us from as well. So please feel free to pop in your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. That would be great. We at ICAN Australia are so pleased to see so many people joining us tonight. The announcement of the nuclear submarines and the unfolding announcements around the new AUKUS agreement since that initial revelation on the 16th of September here have really excited and incited many of us. There are many of our partners and campaign supporters and activists on here tonight or have registered for tonight from literally all over the country and all around the world. It's already clear that the submarine deal and the AUKUS Pact has re-energized anti-militarism and a nuclear-free movement in Australia. Just in the past few weeks, we've seen webinars, organising meetings, statements from a huge range of groups in Australia and elsewhere, every one of them building on our knowledge and drawing connections between activists, academics and thinkers around Australia and around the world. So a quick shout out to all the groups who may be on here tonight or representatives of them who have released statements and are actively organising around this, including the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, the Maritime Union of Australia, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Electrical Trades Union, MAPW, the Medical Association for Prevention of War, the Centre for International Cooperation and Disarmament, the Catholic Religious Australia, Nautilus Institute, the Raucous Anti-AUKUS Caucus, the Anti-Bases Coalition, and many more. There's been such a lot of activity in these last few weeks. But some of you are on tonight who will be new to the world of nuclear politics and international relations or even security issues. So a particular welcome to you, and even more so to those young people who are coming to this work now. You're so welcome here and we so look forward to your contributions. Others who are on here will have been watching, acting, thinking on these issues for years and decades, and that knowledge and experience will be important in the time to come to help one another keep informed and to seek out opportunities to collaborate and to learn and to act together. So a little bit of housekeeping. I'd like to ask everyone to please mute all your microphones so our speakers can be speaking uninterrupted. We will have a short time for Q&A after all the speakers at the end. So participants should keep your questions in mind or pop them in the chat and Q&A functions as we go along. To our panelists then, this is the exciting bit. We feel really honoured to have such a spectacular panel tonight. I'll introduce each of our guests properly before they speak, but let me start by welcoming Reverend James Bhagwan in Fiji, Professor Marianne Hanson in Brisbane, Dr. Muhadi Sugiono in Indonesia, Professor Stephen Ratuva in Aotearoa, and Professor Richard Tanter, also here in Naarm. Tonight, we will hear briefly from each of these people for their many areas of expertise to help build our understandings of AUKUS, about what the nuclear submarine proposal means, and what we need to be watching closely and responding to as this AUKUS agreement unfolds. We will hear about how this announcement was received both in Australia and around the region. We'll also hear more details on what this means for Australian and regional security, alliance, and diplomatic relationships. ICAN Australia has also just released a 2-page brief on this, and it can be found on the ICAN Australia website too. We'll pop a link for that into the chat as well as we go along. But for now, I'm just having a little quick look. Yes, 126 people in there. So we'll get going, I think, with our talanoa, our talk together now. And it is my real pleasure to introduce to you our very first guest, Reverend James Bhagwan. Reverend James is the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches. The PCC have had a long and proud history of standing strong on nuclear issues over many decades. Reverend Bhagwan reminds us that the most Pacific Island states strive to conduct their relationships from a place where they are friend to all, enemy to none. If only we could say the same of Australia in this current climate. Padre James, Nisambula Vinaka, and welcome.
Nisambula Vinaka, thank you so much for having me on. Excuse my a little bit out of breath as I travel to begin my travel to COP, but it is really a great opportunity to speak on behalf of the Pacific Conference of Churches on this very important issue. The churches across the Pacific have been engaging in this issue since the formation of the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement. And we note with real concern the issues around AUKUS, which we have raised directly with the Australian government. This is a real concern for us as we see not only a violation of the Rarotonga Treaty in the sense that even if the countries are not signatories to the Rarotonga Treaty, for those who say they're part of the Pacific family, what does that mean when your actions violate decisions made by the collective, which is something that's very important for Pacific Islands. At the same time, we acknowledge that the Indo-Pacific militarization has a negative effect because it is, we have already seen the rhetoric from China in response to the proposal or Australia's decision or an announcement to buy nuclear submarines. And so we recognize that this is going to be an issue of contention for our Pacific Island countries. It threatens our sovereignty, and it also threatens the protection of our oceans in terms of nuclear powered submarines traveling through our waters. And we've said it before, and we will continue to say it again. We want our Pacific Ocean to be nuclear free, whether it is from nuclear weapons, nuclear waste, or nuclear powered vessels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend James. That's a powerful message, and it's a consistent message, as you say, over a really long period of time. These the calls from the Pacific have been for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific, and that's really important. So thank you so much, and good luck with your trip to speak on behalf of the Pacific at the COP as well. We'll be watching that with great interest and following your leadership over there with great interest. So thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Yeah. Let me turn now to our second speaker. She's our dear colleague and now actually the co-chair of ICAN Australia, Professor Marianne Hanson. She's a teacher and researcher, particularly in international relations at the University of Queensland. Marianne has written extensively on nuclear proliferation and disarmament issues over many, many years, and she knows well the proliferation risks that we are facing in this new agreement. So without much further ado, let me pass you over to Marianne Hanson. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, and greetings to all around the world. Thank you for allowing me to make some comments here. I'm going to be focusing on the non-proliferation risks, or the proliferation risk rather, that accompany this deal. There are many, many ways in which we can criticize this deal, diplomatically, militarily, but I'm going to focus here explicitly on what this means for Australia's long record of supporting non-proliferation and our alleged contribution to promoting a world free of nuclear weapons. There are three ways that I think we can sort of understand these issues. The first is that this deal if it comes ahead, if it is in fact something that we will pursue, and I'm hoping that it isn't, but the way things are going at the moment, it will certainly exploit a loophole in the Non-Proliferation Treaty and also in the IAEA safeguards. This is because the highly enriched uranium that would be used in these nuclear subs can be diverted very easily towards a nuclear weapon. Now, our Prime Minister made it clear that these subs were not going to be equipped with nuclear weapons, they were only going to be nuclear powered. But this is problematic. And I think it does raise some valid criticisms and some justifications about what our intentions really are. No non-nuclear weapon state has developed nuclear submarines. Australia would be breaking with a long-held view that this should not happen. And as I say, this goes against our long record of supporting non-proliferation. As such, this deal would jeopardize our own non-proliferation credentials, and we would lose any leverage that we might think we have over other states wanting to acquire sensitive nuclear technology and diverting this for the purpose of nuclear weapons. The second point that I think is important to note here is that this deal is likely to lead other states to want to do the same thing. We know, for example, that South Korea has been refused this technology in the past by the United States. It and Japan also are possibly considering asking for this technology to be allowed to them. Now, again, these are non-nuclear states, but the problem here is that, particularly within the context of South Korea and Japan, where there is an element within politics which is asking for these states to develop their own nuclear weapons, then we can see an issue here, a problem. If this technology is to be spread to these groups, and if it's been spread to Australia, then why shouldn't South Korea and Japan be treated similarly, one might argue? But the dangers of this material, this highly enriched uranium, being diverted to weapons it's a high danger. It's too risky, put it this way. And it isn't only these states, there's a range of other states, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and a number of others who could also be looking to developing nuclear powered submarines using highly enriched uranium. A third problem here is the strategic destabilization that this deal, and in fact, the whole AUKUS proposition creates. It increases the risks of nuclear war. It could make Australian bases and indeed some of these nuclear submarines targets. Essentially, AUKUS ties us into nuclear submarines and the nuclear industry overall. Is this really what we want? It boxes us into a specific American and British set of defense policies. And there's a great risk that we will lose some of our independence in determining how we will respond to any security threat, including one from China. Do we really want to be involved in battle plans against China? China certainly sees this deal as contributing to a US nuclear threat against China. And it is likely to have implications for how China and probably North Korea and probably Russia also configure their own war fighting plans. So these are all things that we have to keep in mind. I think even if the submarines don't actually happen, and the proposal is something that would take another 20 years or so to eventuate, the damage has been done. And that is going to be very hard to roll that back. The damage done, I think, to the non-proliferation regime, the damage done to Australia's credentials as an upholder of non-nuclear policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I think that's that last warning is a really big one. The damage has been done. And we're seeing that already. We're seeing that in the responses of certain nations who are starting to make those kinds of noises that you warn about there too as well. So it's, yeah, it's very serious, this one. Our next speaker tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Muhadi Sugiono from the Department of International Relations at the Universitas Gadjah Mada. I'm not sure if I'm saying that properly in Indonesia. Hello and welcome. We're so glad that you could join us tonight and bring some of those valuable perspectives about how this news of AUKUS and the nuclear submarines was received in Indonesia in particular. So go right ahead, Muhadi.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here to share my ideas with you. There are two things that I would like to tell you about how this AUKUS pact was received in Indonesia. First of all, let me inform you how the Indonesian government responded to the decision by Australia to acquire the nuclear power submarines. Our foreign minister, Mrs. Retno Marsudi, has been briefed by the Australian counterpart that the Australian government insisted that the nuclear power submarine will not bring nuclear weapons. And for that, the foreign minister could understand that the Australian government would keep its commitment to the NPT as well as other international laws. But at the same time, the foreign minister also viewed that the submarine decisions with very deep caution, and he was very concerned about the continuing arms race in the region and about the power projection of the Australian military. So this can be interpreted in two different ways. On the one hand, it is associated with the fact that Indonesia, along with other ASEAN member countries, has developed what so-called Southeast Asia as nuclear as a zone for peace and freedom and neutrality. And the fact that this will increase the arms race in the region is very worrying for Indonesia, in which Indonesia, in the middle of the conflict between China and the AUKUS partner, including Australia, will be in a very difficult situation because of the fact that Indonesia is basically close to China as well as close to the US. And we have been concerned about being put or pressed to stay in the corner to make a wrong choice, whether we are going along with China or going along with the US. Both positions are not very convenient for Indonesia. And the second interpretation of the remark by the foreign minister is that the fact that the decision was taken without consulting Indonesia, it was very disappointing, given the fact that Indonesia and Australia has improved its relationship following the Timor issue with the Australian engagement with Timor after independence. So, but now the improvement of the relations between Australia and Indonesia didn't seem to be reflected in the fact that Australia took very important decision without consulting Indonesia as the closest neighbors in the region. So it is very disappointing for the Indonesian government. So apart from accepting the explanation by the Australian government, Indonesian government seems to be very disappointed with this decision. And what is also interesting that I would like to tell you all here is the response from the public. It is quite interesting that Indonesian public was not generally very aware of Indonesian foreign policy or international relation issues. But in this case, it was very interesting to see that a hashtag has been very popular, showing Australia is lying. So the hashtag says Australia berbohong. That says that Australia is lying. So why is that? So again, the fact that for the Indonesian public, China is considered as a threat. But the fact that Australia made such a decision to counter Chinese presence in the region was also not acceptable. So, and again, the Indonesian government failed to be left behind in this very important decision. And this hashtag was very, very popular following the statement by Indonesian Foreign Minister that Indonesia deeply concerned with this AUKUS. So this is actually for Indonesia is more associated with the fact that the improvement of the relationship between Indonesia and Australia, including in the political relation as well as military cooperation, did not make Australia think Indonesia as an important and strategic partner to be consulted before making such a very important decision. So that is from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Muhadi. And I really appreciate that that insight about the hashtag that's going around over there. It's one that doesn't surprise me in some senses, because I've been looking at the regional responses to this and people feeling very much put out by this, what is often seen as an Anglo alliance, you know, with some heavy racial sort of overtones to it. So it's really interesting to hear that that's what's happening there. So thank you for reminding us too of the strength of the ASEAN agreements around regional peace and security too, because that's an important part, I think, in this time. So thank you, Muhadi. I would like now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Stephen Ratuva. Stephen is an award-winning political sociologist and global interdisciplinary scholar, the director of the Macmillan Brown Centre for Pacific Studies at the University of Canterbury in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Stephen, Nisam Bolavanaka and Kia ora. We're so pleased that you could join us tonight.
Oh, well, Dimitri. Greetings to everybody. It's windy outside here in Aotearoa, and looks like it's going to rain. But anyway, thanks very much for the invitation. AUKUS has added another layer of crisis in the geopolitical dynamics in this part of the world. And certainly from the point of view of the small island states in the Pacific, it's adding to the kind of layers of neocolonialism, which has been part of their geopolitical evolution over the years. They still remember the testing by the French, by the United States, by the UK in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, in fact, in the 90s, and the Cold War bases all around the Pacific. And one would have thought that those have kind of disappeared into history. But what we're seeing now is a replay of those. One of the differences, those of us who were involved in the nuclear-free independent Pacific movement in the early days, the big, if you like, the big colonial powers, those involved in the nuclear game were far away, the French, the Americans, and the British. But this time it's a bit different. It's right there on a doorstep. It's Australia is going to be a nuclear power by having nuclear submarines. And that changes the whole dynamics. If you're a member of the Pacific Island Forum, for instance, and then you have a nuclear power sitting beside you, that changes the whole, if you like, political outlook in terms of relationship. So the original Indo-Pacific, which was, put together by the Quad, was a way of responding to the what they saw as the Chinese expansionism in this part of the world, and of course globally. And the new Indo-Pacific alliance actually raises the level of militarization and tension and insecurity to another level, and of course underpinned by the kind of xenophobic, the Anglo-racial overtones, which was mentioned earlier. So often we just look at the geopolitics, the militarization aspect, but you also have the underpinning racial discourse, which frame the perception and which sells some of those strategic ideas. So the Five Eyes, for instance, so it links to the Five Eyes, which are kind of Anglo-Saxon alliance which has been in existence. So what you're beginning to see is a kind of racialization of geopolitics in this part of the world, which links back to the imperial expansionism of the early years. So, so the intensification of the Cold War type tension in the Pacific redefines security in the Pacific in a very, very significant ways, where small island states, again, they see themselves caught up between these contending big powers and trying to mobilize their support by selling anti-Chinese narratives or development narratives, giving aid and so forth as a means of gauging and mobilizing their loyalty. Now, the significance, one of the significant aspects here is the return of the UK, the old imperial power. And the UK, of course, after living, after Brexit, sees itself as a new global player on its own. And so the AUKUS provides it with its potential to re-engage itself in the Pacific in a significant way. Interestingly, France, which has been trying to use the original Indo-Pacific as a way of expanding, entrenching its colonial interest in the Pacific, which means that France becomes the biggest country in the world in terms of EEZ because of its colonies in the Pacific, was disappointed because of the shift in the Australian, decision. So in some ways you have the colonial powers and the subcolonial powers competing. And then, of course, the Pacific finds itself in the middle. Now, and of course, Australia becomes a potential target, as mentioned earlier, and certainly the militarization, so the nuclearization of Australia by being part of the military industrial complex, the US military industrial complex, which extends its tentacles all around the world. And now Australia is going to be centered right in the middle of it in the Pacific. So also one of the consequences is that it's against the spirit of the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, which was signed in 1986. There were 3 protocols, and the protocol number 1 talks about no manufacture and so forth of nuclear weapons. Now, there have been debate about whether the submarine is a weapon or not. To me, it is a weapon. It depends very much on how you define weaponry. It's part of a military system. A nuclear submarine is meant for military purposes, although it may not explode like a bomb, but it's like splitting hair here. So it's a direct affront to the spirit of the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, especially protocol number 1. And in some ways, it becomes an insult to the signatories of the treaty, particularly the Pacific Island Forum countries who were signatories to that. So, and of course, New Zealand here, which is a nuclear-free neighbor. What are they saying? What are we saying? Well, a lot. I know Jacinda hasn't told off Morrison or anything like that, but certainly within the discussions in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of anger, knowing that our nearest neighbor across the ditch, as they say, is going to be a nuclear power, is going to be a manufacturer of nuclear submarines at some point in the future. So I remember when the French were testing their bombs, the Australians were saying, oh, the French are full of delusions of self-grandeur and so forth. And now I would say the same thing. Australia now is full of delusions of self-grandeur. So what's the whole purpose of militarizing yourself in nuclear submarine? We realized that after the Cold War, a lot of this were destroyed because they were useless. Total waste of money, waste of energy, waste of effort. So is it going to be another case of what one might call futile, outdated, mythical masculinity in the production of weaponry? And so I suppose it's time for the revival of the nuclear-free independent Pacific movement, which started in the Pacific in 1975. And I'm very heartened by the fact that you mentioned, Dimitri, earlier, that you've had discussions, you have forums, you have a lot of networking in Australia in response to what has happened. And I think it's important to kind of expand that. It's not only an Australian issue, it is a regional issue, it is a global issue. The militarization, the global military-industrial complex is huge. They feed into the wars, they feed into violence, they feed into death. So thank you so much, and thanks so much for the opportunity.
Stephen, that's wonderful to hear your thoughts, and I absolutely agree. This is not just an Australian issue. It just is that our government is being particularly aggressive and assertive in this space right now. And it actually does affect all of our region, as you say. I think also if we look at, the number of, as you were pointing out, the Pacific Island Forum states, the Rarotonga Treaty, the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, 10 of those Pacific Island Forum states are also members of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And 6 of the ASEAN states have also ratified that, and 3 more have signed it. So we really are surrounded by a very strong and vocal anti-nuclear position. It's just Australia has been deaf to that, and we need to make them sit up and hear. So thank you again, Stephen Vanakavakalevu, for your input. Stick around, we're going to have lots of questions, no doubt. Can I just remind everyone, we've got one more speaker, and then we'll be turning ourselves to question and answer time. We're going to have a good time to do that. Please put questions into the chat so that we can actually pick some of those out to put to our wonderful speakers tonight. Okay. It's now very much my pleasure again to introduce our final speaker for tonight. That's Professor Richard Tanter. Richard works on nuclear weapons with the Nautilus Institute and teaches on nuclear weapons and disarmament at the University of Melbourne. He is also the former president of the board for ICAN Australia, a very dear friend to very many of us here, and continues to provide an amazing amount of valuable advice and support to many of us. So Richard, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you. Richard, you're muted, sorry.
Thank you. I'm speaking from Nam, as Dimitri, on Wurundjeri land. And I think that point is really relevant to precisely what Stephen has just been saying, that beginning, that very small beginning in Australia, that it is something other than an Anglosphere country. And that's a very deep problem at the moment. Very quickly about this. Firstly, the AUKUS agreement has to be seen as deeply retrograde. It is really literally going back to 100 years and more to the time of federation. But it's another instance in that Anglosphere way of looking towards empire as if we don't exist otherwise. And this is very, very seriously. Dim said that's a racialized notion, and I really do not think we should let go of that. That really has to be understood very, very clearly here. The British thing, part of it is really basically absurd in terms of an American attempt to rescue Johnson and Brexit from its own folly. The only serious part for Australia is the risk that we might get dumped with British nuclear submarines, which are expensive, which don't work, and which are dangerous in their own right. Otherwise, let's leave it apart. The submarines, because they're the symbol of all this, this has nothing to do with the defence of Australia. If we had really been planning on the defence of Australia, we would have been going back with the original French proposal. These submarines, whether they are the US model or the UK model, are twice the size of the submarines we've got now and of the French ones that were being proposed. They really only function, their real function is to be part of an American attack group on China. That's the range that is wanted. That's the function, the integration that's wanted. This is really a very chaotic and ill thought through strategic decision by Australia, which we are going to pay for a long time if these submarines come to fruition. They're designed really for nuclear purposes, not so much nuclear power in this case, but they are primarily in America's most important concern to help destroy China's nuclear second strike capability. These are hunter-killer submarines which are designed to find other submarines, and in particular, China's nuclear ballistic missile submarines. And we hate the idea of deterrence, but I can promise you one thing, that international relations must rest on prudence as much as possible. And the idea of a country like China, which of course does not exist in a balance of mutually assured destruction with the United States, the most imbalanced balance of terror, or non-balance of terror, the prospect that we will be helping them in their worst fears being realized is something we are going to pay for a long time to come. Everything the previous speakers have said in this regard is absolutely right there. I think it's really important to understand a bit more, and other speakers have really alluded to this, that Australia, well, as a friend of mine says, China is not worried about American bases in Australia. China sees Australia as an American base. And this is more true than it has ever been before. And the submarine deal, such as it is, and we really know very little in reality about it, and AUKUS really buys us much more deeply into that. Most people on this call will know about the role of the Pine Gap base in Central Australia in terms of its role in facilitating American nuclear attacks on other countries. It's a very serious issue. This move, AUKUS, in this absurd AUKUS strategy, really brings up something which we had forgotten about for a long time, but which was worked out a long time ago. One of the awful logics of nuclear weapons use is the idea, which is deep in American thinking, that you can use nuclear weapons in a limited way. You can start small from conventional weapons, and perhaps you graduate to a small use as a signal of a single nuclear weapon. It was long ago worked out that Pine Gap is the best possible target for Russia and China if they wanted to use a single nuclear weapon as a signal, a warning shot to the United States. You might think this is hyperbole, but I promise you this has been thought about, and it makes a great deal of sense strategically in that revolting logic. And we need to think about that. Australia finds it very hard to think about itself in the terms that Muhadi and Steve and James have talked about. We are a deeply militarized country. We're a liberal country. We've got human rights. Surely we couldn't be militarized. We are deeply militarized, and it's a high-tech alliance form of militarization. This has been deepening in recent years, particularly through the bases in Darwin, in Northwest Cape and other places, and Pine Gap and other places in Australia. But this takes it one level further, and the Chinese will never forget this, even if we back out of it. We have declared our intention in this regard. We are a kind of liberal high-tech alliance militarist country, and we need to start recognizing that and working out what we're going to do. This brings up the question that Muhadi raised about his sense, I think, that Australia doesn't recognize Indonesia. It does not. It does not take Indonesia seriously. This is one of the appalling truths about this, and I think many Indonesian strategic thinkers actually understand this quite well. We do not understand Indonesia that wants to be non-aligned. We do not understand Indonesia, which was one of the main actors in not just the formation of the Southeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone, but in the zone of peace and freedom and neutrality that Muhadi referred to. What on earth could that mean, asked the people in Canberra. We don't want to be neutral. We want to be on one side, the right side, the American imperial side. this is something which leads on to my last point, and it's something I think ICAN and partner organisations will need to think about. And I noticed that Annette Brownlee is there as the president of ICAN, another organisation I'm very pleased to have some small role in. We have to start thinking about the US alliance. And for ICAN, that's actually a bit of a problem. That's telling me to stop, don't worry. For ICAN, that's a new and tricky problem to think through. Secondly, Australia as a whole, the peace movement, and ICAN as well, has to start thinking very seriously about China. I do not think of China as the great bogey that is coming to get us, but if I lived in Tibet, or if I lived in Taiwan, or Hong Kong, or Vietnam, I'd probably be a bit more anxious. Paul Keating got it right in a rather silly way when he said great powers are rude. I would just say great powers are often nasty, particularly to the countries they can push around most easily. That doesn't mean that China's a threat to Australia in the way it's being presented to us in these racialized terms of, what was his name? The silent invasion of Australia by Clive Hamilton. That's a really nasty way and a foolish way of thinking about it. But how do we think about two imperially minded countries at the same time, which have enormous influence over us? And that leads to the third point that we have to think about, and ICAN, I think, has to think about this. What is an independent foreign policy, an independent defence policy for Australia? What does it actually involve? We often don't want to get involved in that because it partly involves talking with people we don't like very much. But also, if we don't get involved in it, we are abandoning the field. And so that question of what an independent Australian defence policy, foreign policy is going to be looking like, I actually think for a country which is deeply militarised, deeply nuclearised, as Stephen just said, this is absolutely central. What is the pathway to where we want to go? I'll leave it at that.
Well, you don't leave it at small things, do you, Richard? That's fantastic.
I can. Who are these people who thought they could start, a nuclear prohibition movement? Just a couple of mugs meeting in a coffee shop in Melbourne, like you.
It's a very excellent question that you land us with at the end there, and I thank you very much. Thank you to all of those 5 speakers. What a remarkable bunch of expertise to have in the room. I know there's plenty of other people. I've just been flipping through the screens, looking at who else has joined us here. It's just wonderful to see the vigorous chat that's going on in the chat room as well. I just wanted to just recap a little bit. We heard from Reverend James at the top. Some of you may not have heard him, unfortunately. He was running through the airport to go to the COP. But he was talking about the strong concerns that have been heard throughout the Pacific, those large ocean states, about keeping our oceans nuclear free. Marianne reminded us that there's no nuclear sub has been developed or deployed by any country that doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's a really important thing, and points out that the damage has been done even now without those nuclear subs even coming into operation or manifesting in the ways that they could. The damage has been done to the reputations around this. Muhadi, you reminded us that there's a hashtag going around Indonesia at the moment. Australia is lying, is the translation. And there's many people who responded to that in the chat as well, I see. ASEAN states are deeply concerned about the balance of security and stability in the region, and as Stephen Ratuva reminds us too, so are the Pacific Island states. We have a very strong and really consistent history of nuclear resistance throughout this region. And we have had in Australia as well. And we do have in Australia as well, as is evidenced by the numbers of people who are getting active and engaged on this issue. We also talked a bit about the deeply radicalized militarism. We've been there before, and the real concerns that whilst, as Stephen says, this may not explode, the submarines may not explode like a bomb, but they are a nuclear war fighting machine. So we hear, the calls for a revival of the nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement. I never thought it went away too much, but it would be great to see it much more vigorous again now. But I think I might start to the panelists and ask a quick question, which is from what Richard said right there at the end. what is an independent Australian defence policy? How would that look? It would be really great to hear that from a couple of you. Just hear your thoughts in answer to Richard's very pertinent question there. Who would like to start?
While people are thinking, I'll just say that Annette Brownlee is online, and I just want to point people who don't know about it to the remarkable work that Annette and her colleagues did with the ICAN, Independent Peaceful Australia Network, inquiry into the impact of the US alliance. And there are a great many really interesting submissions online, and I'm sure they're going to be producing a very interesting report about that, but it might be a useful place for people to go to.
Absolutely, there's some incredible resources in those submissions, really detailed and thoughtful submissions. Stephen, do you have any thoughts about what Australia could look like as an independent Pacific state in our region? Do you have any thoughts about what that would look like coming from Aotearoa?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the opportunity, although I'm not an Australian, but I do have views about Australia. So one of the things about Aotearoa is that its foreign policy has been, over the years, has been quite independent from declaring itself nuclear free, and the Americans were not happy with it in 1985-86 under David Longy, and of course it caused a bit of stir within the Five Eyes by saying that its foreign policy is not going to be framed along the lines of Five Eyes, and it's been left out of AUKUS as well. I suppose the AUKUS members realize that it's probably going to be futile trying to get in New Zealand because it might simply say no. So one of the things about Australia, which people from outside Australia have noticed, is the way in which it's kind of playing the role of the deputy sheriff, monkey see, monkey do kind of foreign policy. The Americans do it, I do it as well. The US says, please join the coalition of the willing and so forth. Yeah, that is the perception from outside. Compared to Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's been trying to be independent in terms of its foreign policy, not necessarily aligned with the US or the so-called Western Bloc as such. And with a new foreign minister, they're increasingly becoming more and more independent and focusing on the Pacific in terms of the Mada, in terms of the people-to-people relationship, rather than just a state-to-state institutional relationship. So perhaps in New Zealand, there has to be an internal transformation, I suppose a revolution in terms of how it perceives itself in relation to the region, the Pacific and Asia, and then changes its attitude, its orientation, rather than its alliance with the US is very, very strong. And now the UK is coming back. AUKUS is going to provide Australia with, it's going to give it a bit more ego in terms of the geopolitics of this region. And off it flies off, into the clouds. So I suppose it has to come down to earth at some point. Yeah.
Vinaka, thanks for that, Stephen. Marianne, would you like to have an answer to that question too?
Yes, certainly. I should also say that I'm a big fan of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I have lived there for a number of years and I miss it greatly. And I wish that Australia could emulate some of the policies that that country has enacted. To me, there are a number of problems here. Australians seem to be fed a diet of fear. So our foreign policy is driven by fear, by cliches, by a certain amount of racism as well. I was reading a very, very good article today by Brendan O'Connor from Sydney University, and he pointed out how remarkable it is, even after the failures that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, how remarkable it is that Australia still believes that military solutions are the answers to our problems. That has been evident for decades now. A simple reliance on force will not get us anywhere. It didn't get us anywhere with the Taliban, and it certainly will not be anything productive if we want to develop a better relationship with China. So I would say that an Australian foreign policy really would have to break ranks somewhat with the United States. And let's face it, the track record of US foreign policy over the past 20 years has been pretty appalling. Is that something that we want to join ourselves to? And in particular, if somebody like Trump is re-elected in 2024, do we really want to be joined at the hip to the US? I'm thinking that we need to loosen that considerably. We need to stop focusing on elements of fear and demonizing the other. We desperately need to recognize and respect our regional neighbors. That's in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. And I can only apologize to my friends in those regions. Not everybody thinks the same way that the Australian government does, but it would make such a big start if we were to acknowledge the presence and the richness of our region, and then work creatively and positively with our regional friends. To me, there's no reason why we cannot do that, no reason whatsoever. And then overlaying all of that, there has to be a recognition that the use of force has a very limited utility in foreign policy and security policy these days. Even if it could be relied on in the past to achieve political objectives, that is far, far from uncertain today. So there really has to be a move away from this emphasis on force, and there has to be a move away from a deep sense of militarization that I've seen develop in Australia over the past 2 decades.
Yes, thank you, Marianne. That's very powerful words and thoughts there. Muhadi, did you have any thoughts from outside of I know there's a few people who are keen to have a little bit of input, but have you got any thoughts from outside of Australia as well? We'd love to hear them.
For me, there are two things at least. The first thing is that I find that Australia hasn't finished yet with the struggle in the search for identity. In the past, when Paul Keating and Bob Hawke in power, Australia would like to reorient their position and identity as Asian, and then it moved back to the other position as European in Asia, and so on and so on. So this seems to me that the struggle for identity is still going on in Australia, and Australia does not seem to know exactly where Australia should stay. And the second thing is that for me, it is quite unfortunate that Australian government did not make use of the opportunity with the fact that Indonesia has changed very, very dramatically from the previous system, which now has become more and more cooperative and can be a good partner for Australia with regard to the stability and peace in the region. And the fact that Indonesia is among the strongest supporter of ASEAN declaration on the Indo-Pacific, statement on Indo-Pacific, that Indonesia would like to encourage whatever arrangement that emerge in this region, then it should be very inclusive and away from using the military confrontation. And what Australia is doing now seems to be on the contrary to this expectation, that Australia engagement with AUKUS tend to sharpen the competition, the arms race in the region, something that is Indonesian government not like to see it. And therefore, this kind of forum is quite good for me to build trust among the people of both parties. The hashtag Australia berbohong, Australia is lying, is also indicating that the trust between Indonesian people and Australian are not well developed even today. And we could build a better trust among both people in order to improve the relationship between Australia and Indonesia, as well as to bring more peace to the region.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Muhadi. I can see there's several people with their hands up where we have a lot of questions in the chat as well, but I'll just give a quick 1 minute to a couple of people who've got their hands up. Other than that, please try and pop your questions in the chat. We're trying to keep on top of them, but there's many of them. So I'll start with Annette. Annette from ICAN. Did you want to answer just quickly Richard's question that was asked?
Yeah, thanks, Dimity, and apologies for being late. I just think what Richard has raised is crucial. We will not make any traction with the broader Australian community if we are if we just present peace and various ways forward that they just can't come to terms with at this particular time. I think listening to Clinton Fernandez and his reality check, really, that we need to be presenting an Australian Defence Force that is about defending Australia in a political situation where we are non-aligned. So from what that's his point. If we can marry those two together, that we do have an effective defence force that's about defence, but that we act as a non-aligned nation. I'll leave it at that to leave other time for other speakers here.
Thank you so much, Annette. Yeah, it's an interesting one, and one that we'll have a lot more discussion on. I'm absolutely sure over the coming months. Nick McClellan, you had your hand up very quickly.
I had a question for Stephen about how he thinks this will play out within the Pacific Islands Forum at a time where the Pacific neighbours are talking very much about a new definition of security, particularly around climate change. Frank Bainimarama, the current chair of the forum the other day, said that if we can spend trillions on missiles, drones and nuclear submarines, can we fund climate action? And I think the timing of this is really significant. And I wonder if you could comment on that in terms of how people in the Pacific are going to react to the notion that Australia is moving down a path about rearmament, you know, at a time where there's a desperate need for development finance, for climate finance and so on.
Oh, Nick, nice to meet you again. Yeah, thanks for the question. Very, very timely question, particularly now, where if you remember the bold declaration by the forum in 2018 in Nauru, where they identified climate crisis as the major, also most significant security issue in the Pacific. And that has been, if you like, the narrative. It has been part of the forum thinking and the small island states thinking over the years. And a lot of energy, a lot of resources, a lot of thinking have been channeled into it. Now, all of a sudden, one of their colleagues of the forum has become a nuclear power, a lot of money, a lot of resources, and of course, a whole controversy of geopolitical dynamics in the last few weeks has shifted towards Australia. So suddenly, which means that a lot of small island states are asking the question, why is Australia doing this? First of all, its commitment to climate crisis, to the climate change, has not been very, very encouraging. Has been dismal, and now its focus is to do with militarization, is to do with building up its nuclear submarine fleet, which means that a lot of resources which should have been used for addressing the climate crisis is now being diverted elsewhere. So on one hand, you have Australia's stance in being criticized for not too forthcoming in relation to its commitment to the climate crisis, and then on top of that, you have diversion of resources towards the hard security aspect, And that leaves a lot of Pacific Island states beginning to ask the question, can we trust Australia as a neighbor, as a member of the forum? And of course, a lot of criticism against Australia over the years has been the way it uses the forum as a means by which it establishes, it entrenches its hegemonic control within the region, and using aid as a means by which is able to mobilize support and so forth. So yeah, that adds another layer of criticism of Australia's role in the region as the big power with a big stick, with the money being diverted towards enhancing that power, that hegemonic control, rather than for the purpose of addressing human security in relation to climate crisis in the region.
Wonderful, thank you, Stephen. Yes, the day before the AUKUS agreement came out, the organization, the Climate Council here in Australia, just released yet another report showing that our greatest security threat is climate in this region, and that this needs to be answered. So, you know, we've heard this again and again and again, and yet here we are. Not 24 hours later, they were launching this agreement. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? We've got one more person asking a question online, but I'd rather people actually put their questions in the chat. We're trying to get through these as quickly as possible. John, did you have something to ask?
I'm not sure if it qualifies as a question or a comment, and
Keep it short.
Nearest, I'm trying to keep it short, and the nearest that any one of the speakers came to talking about this issue was Richard Tanter. But something which I've had my nose rubbed in really thoroughly was the extent to which the decision makes no technical or military sense. The fact is that nuclear submarines are not the best or the quietest submarine with which to kill another ship or another submarine. So purely from within the narrowest technical and military criteria, the decision makes absolutely no sense. I commend to people the lovely YouTube of a Collins-class submarine back in 2011 evading a US hunter-killer submarine and proceeding to sink a US destroyer. With a cheeky rendition of The Land Down Under at the end of it.
Thank you, John. That's great. All right, well, listen, there's a million questions and comments and so much to be said, and wouldn't it be lovely if we had all the time in the world to actually have conversations with one another in this way, and hopefully we will be able to do those soon as people are coming out of lockdown and so forth. But I'm going to just run through a couple of really quick questions, and these are kind of summarized by Jem. Thank you, Jem, for getting them out here. And we might start with a couple that are specifically around what the AUKUS agreement actually has in it at the moment that we know about, because it's important to remember that we don't know terribly much. This has been announced with great flourish, and you know, the fella from down under, but we don't actually know a lot of details at the moment. But a few people have asked questions like, is there any discussion about Australia mining and selling uranium? I might just quickly answer that one, which is that we do mine and sell uranium, and we sell it to nuclear armed states and have done for a very long time. There's lots of information on that we can supply. You can look at other organisations, particularly like Friends of the Earth, the Australian Conservation Foundation, those sorts of ones, to find out the details of that mining and that selling of uranium. Another question was, is it HEU or LEU, so highly enriched uranium or low enriched uranium being used in the nuclear submarines? Maybe I'll throw this one back to Richard and Marianne to just answer very quickly on that.
Highly enriched uranium is used at least by the American submarines, and that is uranium which has been enriched to somewhere between 90 and 96%. As opposed to low enriched uranium, which is a much, much lower level, something like 3 to 4%. But Richard, you will know better than I.
Thanks, Marianne. I think there's a misunderstanding I've seen in the chat. The British submarines do not use low enriched uranium. They, like the American ones, they use weapons grade, highly enriched uranium. It's the French submarines that use low enriched uranium. And it's become clear from what Malcolm Turnbull said, apart from his quite wonderful attack on the government, over the submarine decision, but he did reveal that the Australian Defence Department had in its mind the possibility with the French submarines that the first 2 or 3 ordered could be conventional, and then we could have switched to the French submarine. That's something that was hidden, and I think the point I want to make is we need people to be digging very deep into these issues as they happen and getting involved in understanding this stuff. We've got a pretty tame media on these matters. More generally, I think Marianne's absolutely right. The highly enriched uranium is a very serious issue. It was technically chosen, allegedly, and this is allegedly, we've got to be very careful about what's being said from government friends on these matters, because in the French nuclear submarine with their low enriched uranium would have had to been birthed for about a year every 10 years, so that the low enriched uranium reactor could be, and fuel units could be taken out completely and then put back. This was deemed to be unacceptable. The American highly enriched uranium reactors and fuel units would be there for their entire lives. And isn't that so much better? This is all largely nonsense, because of course, if you look at any of these nuclear submarines or our Collins class submarines, which at the moment only one of them goes to sea every Tuesday afternoon, every month or so. These spend a lot of time in port. They have to. It's actually very hard to build a submarine, let alone a nuclear submarine, let alone a long-range nuclear submarine. So this is largely nonsense. We made the choice for the American submarines for quite different reasons. And so a lot of what the government is saying here is misleading, to put it kindly.
Indeed. Great. Well, thank you very much for those answers to those questions. There's a great one here, and I like this one particularly. How do we get out of this arrangement? I quite like that question. Has anyone got any great brainstorm ideas right now about that? Marianne, Richard, Stephen, and Muhadi, it would be really great to hear from you about this again. Let's start with Marianne.
We vote this government out early next year. Labor has committed to signing the TPNW, this is the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. If Australia was to sign that treaty and ratify it, that would be the best thing we could do to reassure the world and our near neighbours that we are serious about a non-nuclear world. My sense is that even though Labor appear to have generally agreed with the proposal to acquire nuclear subs, I think that it will be allowed to die quietly in time, and I'm hoping that that is the case.
Great, thank you, Marianne. Good reminder, we do have that election coming up, hey? Stephen, yes?
If I can just quickly respond to that, but also link up with what John mentioned earlier in relation to the fact that the submarine makes no military sense at all. I think it's a great point. It links to what I was saying earlier in relation to the military industrial complex, because what has happened in the last whole decades or so is the commodification, marketization of war. Weapons are produced just to make money, so war becomes a profitable business, and so you have not only the military, the big corporations, the big contractors, and universities who do the research all together, and there's so much behind the scene kind of collaboration taking place, and lobbying as well. And the fact that the contract has shifted from France to Australia, it's interesting to see the kind of lobbying taking place and the role of the big contractors behind it who make lots of money, trillions of dollars from the arms race in the Cold War. And politicians become the salesmen. Obama was the salesman when he went over as part of his visit to Asia, and Trump went around selling billions of dollars worth of arms in the Middle East. That classical picture of him showing the Saudi Arabians, the latest jets, blah, 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 like little kids, like toys. So underneath all this geopolitical attention, all those things, the contractors, the big money-making machinery, and they sustain the US economy. They sustain. So Australia now is going to be part of that. So in the US, they call it the revolving door. People have been working in the White House, in the Pentagon. They become consultants for these big companies, contractors. So it's a big, shadowy, dark world that we're only scratching the surface of. And now this is also part of that as well. So I've been doing some work around that area as well. So it's quite interesting to see the linkages. So it doesn't make military sense, as John said, but it makes a lot of economic sense for some people.
Naka, Stephen, you remind us very well about the issue of state capture on these issues and many others. And we're seeing that, playing out very clearly in the politic here to some extent. I will go to Richard. Richard, did you have a reply to that?
Well, just very quickly, obviously we need a new government. That would help a great deal. We need a government which will sign the nuclear ban treaty. I'm not quite as sanguine as Marianne that voting Labor is the immediate solution to that. And I think that actually what Stephen just said has pointed us to the depths of the alliance. We need to understand, not only has this been here for almost 70 years, that's older than I am, and I'm pretty old, but Stephen referred to the defence industry aspects of it. And remember that companies like Lockheed Martin, the biggest armament company in the world, deeply involved in nuclear weapons, not only to my own shame, has a branch at Melbourne University and is funding Melbourne University. It is embedded, for example, in the department, in the Defence Science and Technology Organisation as a recognised partner, and it's on their land. It is deeply involved in what are otherwise deemed to be Australian defence innovations. Let's go. We don't have a defence industry. We have branches of American and European armaments companies. I don't mean to say that's the end of the story about what's going to happen, but if we are to get, and that's part of what we're talking about today, to get the ban treaty signed and ratified by Australia, my own feeling is this is a very deep and long political project. By all means, vote for the Labor government, but then we must be very much looking at how will we keep them to their word. That's going to be very, very, very hard, and we must work out a way of doing it.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. Muhadi, did you have something to answer in terms of that question of how do we get out of this arrangement?
Yes, theoretically speaking, I prefer to look at international relations from the constructivist point of view, in which I don't particularly keen to look at the behavior of states from the always rational calculations. Sometimes it is something to do beyond rationality that can be also with identity, which I always mentioned in the presentation previously. So what I mean by that is I find that what Australia is doing now is Australia seems to punch below its weight. For us, Australia is a middle power. Normally, middle power work more toward the through norm rather than the military power or hard power. And by aligning itself with the competing power in terms of military confrontation with China, then it seems that Australia does not have any confidence to play its role as a middle power. And I guess Australia can be much better off to if Australia can play according to the role that it can play as a middle power in the region. region at least.
Thank you, Muhadi. Thank you so much for that. It's true. We should be punching at our weight, not below our weight, definitely. Marianne, you had a quick reply there too?
Yes, I agree entirely with Richard that it's not by any means a foregone conclusion that Labor will sign, and we need to be working really, really hard on this and hold them to account. ICAN's already doing this through the local government associations, parliamentarians. There are hundreds of parliamentarians who are supportive of this, but it's certainly something we've got to keep working on. I fully agree with the point that Stephen and others had made that the weapons industries have captured political parties and individuals in a way that is even more profound now than it was during the Cold War. And one example of that I'd like to point to, Australia was a champion of the Arms Trade Treaty in the UN in 2013. We now violate that treaty with impunity. We are exporting weapons to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are being used in the war in Yemen, for example. So the governments need to change. People within Australia need to be aware of this, and we need to have a government that will be accountable. We need to hold them to high standards of ethical behavior.
Thank you so much. I am running my eyes through the very many comments, the questions and so forth on this, on the chat, and I'm afraid that we're not going to get through all of them at all, but I'm hoping that you're hearing some of the answers or some of the discussion points, or it's exciting some of your minds about the ways that we can continue these discussions in time to come. I did want to point to, in terms of the very important question about state capture and the involvement of the nuclear weapons manufacturers, of whom there are many. And they are, as Stephen says, you know, they're worth trillions. This industry is worth a lot of money, right? One of the great parts of the ICAN platform here in Australia, but also internationally, is the divestment campaigns. And these divestment campaigns are really important as part of the work that is happening and the increasing sort of campaigning that we are doing. So here in Australia, the campaign is called Quit Nukes. It's got its own website. It's one that's shared between MAPW, the Medical Association for Prevention of War, and ICAN Australia. I really urge you to go on that, have a look at who is there and the work that's being done there. The other one is called Don't Bank on the Bomb, and that's the international campaign around divestment from nuclear weapons. Incredible amount of resources, incredible amount of research over a number of years now. So if you're interested in looking at those connections between the corporations and nuclear weapons, I really urge you to go and have a look at that as well. There are, as I said, a million other questions. I did actually, though, want to turn to some of the answers that people have thrown into the chat. You know, people have been saying that we need to build a movement in Australia and around the world, bringing together the peace and anti-war and environment movements, protecting the climate against war, that kind of stuff. We've heard a lot of people calling out the importance of the union movement, and traditionally the union movements have been absolutely essential in the work for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific, for the work for against nuclear projects in this country, but all around the world as well. So certainly, you know, calling out and singing out those linkages as well. There's lots of calls for better education, and this is, I think, really key myself. I think that there's a lot of things that we don't know, and I think there's a lot of questions that we do need to keep asking about this, but better education is always really key. So finding ways to get that information out and about, and one of those ways that is coming up at the beginning of November, IPAN, who Annette was speaking just before, asked me to remind people that there's a coalition building Zoom meeting on Sunday, the 7th of November at 2 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, 3 p.m. for those of us in lockdown in Melbourne, still probably. And yeah, people are invited to join in that ICAN meeting. There's also ICAN and Friends of the Earth in Melbourne have petitions that people can sign against the nuclear proposal. So I would urge you to go and find those petitions on the Independent Peaceful Australian Network and also the Friends of the Earth website as well. I might just quickly turn for 1 second to our dear Jem Remold, the ICAN Australia director, and the one who actually organised this event tonight, so along with a few of the board members. So Jem, could you just take us through a couple of things that ICAN Australia is doing in this space at the moment too?
Sure. So yeah, thanks so much everyone for coming. It's great to see you all, and it's really hard to keep up with the chat, which indicates a fair bit of interest and energy on this issue. And you know, we're seeing this as a really important issue and also a really useful hook. You know, I'm sure some of you might have heard of this thing of when there's a crisis, there's an opportunity with that. It's a crisis-opportunity. So this is the opportunity that's provided to us to get bigger and to get louder and to build a stronger peace and anti-nuclear movement. A thing that we've been doing for a few months already, and many people on this call are part of it, is building a cohort of people who are advocating directly to parliamentarians at all levels of government and also to local councils. And this is another really good, really important issue to raise with those people. In a coordinated way with other people, some people prefer to go and have meetings alone, but it basically involves forming a relationship with parliamentarians and educating them, coming to learn what what their resistance is, providing new information to them, because they can't really be across everything, and they need to hear from you as well. There's already been a number of meetings that have happened with even coalition MPs that ICAN hasn't been able to get in the door with. So it's mutually reinforcing, and it really helps with the campaign. If you're keen to do that, we do have a way for you to sign up, and then we'll be in contact and we can connect you with other people who are in your area, or just provide background information on that person and support for you to talk to them. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute. But basically, it's pre-election time. The moment is ripe. And this is the time to get bigger and louder. And if they won't meet with you, then we need to escalate and get louder again. So it's a big issue, but please don't be subdued into inaction, and let's move forward with this.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jem. Lots to do there. Sorry, I'm looking through the chat again. The Raucous Anti-AUKUS Caucus, which met last week, is also doing a second meeting on the 4th of November. So we've got the IPAN meeting on the 2nd, and then the Raucous Anti-AUKUS Caucus meeting on the 4th of November. There's many more things coming up. I'm sorry if I've missed any in the chat. It's very hard to keep across it all. We're about at closing though, and I wanted to take just 1 minute each for each of our amazing speakers tonight. I wanted to first of all thank them. It's been incredible to have such a breadth of experience and points of view in this room. And I wanted to take just a minute for each of you to give us one key message that you would like people to take away from what you've said tonight. Maybe just a little quick roundup of what you think is the key thing around this agreement and the key thing that people should be thinking about. So I might start, unfortunately, Reverend James has left us. He'll be on a plane somewhere at the moment, I suspect, from Nandi Airport. So I will go to Marianne first and ask you to give us that key message, Marianne.
I guess I would say it's really important for all of us to be aware of what's going on, to have these conversations with our friends and family, make these issues well known, contact our superannuation funds, contact our banks. We each have a lot of power in acting on these issues. So I would really encourage everybody to keep being educated and keep being being active.
Thank you. Muhadi, would you have a last message to everybody?
Yeah, it is very unfortunate that the arms race in the region also has led Indonesia to think of increasing military capability, and the fact that Australia is doing also the same thing. This create another motivation for Indonesia to increase its military capability. This is international relation where security dilemma is also at work. So even if Australia is having better relations with Indonesia, but the fact is once Australia is remilitarizing, then Indonesia is forced to do this also.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. That's such an important point. Stephen, one last message from you.
Well, thanks. Maybe just two last messages, very, very short. One is that yeah, the idea,
really.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I like the idea of divesting, you know, from various companies and so forth. But it's quite tricky because you know, companies like Boeing and Airbus are also commercial providers of services, very much at the heart of the military industrial complex, the contractors as well. So yeah, so we're tied to this kind of complex system where it's almost as if don't touch it, because otherwise, you know, what we provide is not going to be viable. But anyway, yeah, the last point is to do with you know, reviving this movement is great. You know, since the end of the Cold War, a lot of the anti-nuclear movements came to an end. I think it's time to revive it. What we've seen the last few years is this people's movement emerging in dramatic ways and redefining global politics in a significant way. The Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the climate change movement of young, you know, people, and a whole lot of that. So what you're seeing now is the power of mobilization of citizens, of people around the world, and how that, although we have big corporations, states with big weaponry, I suppose the power of people in mobilizing and expressing their sentiments and their demands has a long way to go in terms of changing things. Yeah.
Vinaka, Stephen, for that, absolutely. And now lastly to Richard, one last note or two.
Timothy, just two. It's been wonderful to be on a forum, not only with 5 terrific people, but people who are in Aotearoa in Indonesia. And I'm not sure where James was, but I know he's on an aeroplane now.
Fiji.
In Australia, we have, although ICAN has been remarkably extraordinarily successful in generating an international movement that worked. By and large, the Australian peace movement has moved backwards for the last decade or two. And it's wonderful to actually be in a forum where there is serious commitment to internationalism and listening to each other. Much, much more of this is needed. And I really hope that we have Muhadi here, we have Stephen here, and some of our people go with them to third countries, because the military systems are connected. And so the peace movement has to be connected in the same way. The last point is to reinforce what Marianne said. We need to educate ourselves. You know, we weren't born into this stuff. You know, we had to learn it some along the way, some of us. It's not that hard. This is not rocket science. It's amazing how much information is there. And that underpins the confidence, the heart of the argument about identity. We can be something else. We can find out what's wrong. We can work together, particularly across national borders, to do something about this monster.
Thank you so much. What wonderful speakers we've had tonight. Can everyone please give a round of applause to them? I can do this from here. I'm sure you're all doing the same thing. But Vinaka Vakalev, thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions. And it's true, there is so much to learn. There's so much to listen to. There's so much to share together and to speak together. And I'm really looking forward to a lot more of this. Again, there's a whole lot of, if you see in the chat there, there's a lot of different events coming up and so forth. There are petitions to sign, there are forums to join, there are actions through ICAN Australia, which Jem outlined, and there's that really wonderful new 2-page sheet that ICAN Australia has just put out, which Jem has put into the chat as well. What we'll do is we'll make sure that we try and capture some of that and send it around to you all, along with the recordings from tonight's forum. So I just want to end by thanking again our wonderful speakers, and also to thank all of you for taking this time to listen and to share your thoughts and to share your questions and to share your knowledge with each other as well. So thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all. Stay well.